Alright guys, so over the last 6 or 7 months, I've covered countless different lies coming out of the Israeli government and their defenders in the US media and political sphere, etc. But this lie here may be up there in terms of how grotesque and dishonest and brazen it is. So here from Joe Scarborough, which as a reminder, we got that reporting a while back that this is apparently Joe Biden's favorite morning show, okay? Joe Scarborough says that the United Nations has halved the estimates of women and children killed in Gaza. Apparently, the Hamas figures repeatedly cited are false. So this is a pretty big claim here that he's making. He's saying the figures that we've all been using coming out of the Gaza Ministry of Health are totally unreliable, and that the actual number of women and children that have been killed is half the amount that we have been talking about. So a pretty big claim, if it was true. Now, Joe Scarborough is not the only one who has been spreading this lie around. We've had countless different U.S. outlets, international outlets, who have had headlines like this. I mean, this is from Fox News. UN revises Gaza death toll, almost 50% less women and children killed than previously reported. And they say here in the byline, President Biden echoed Hamas's health ministry death toll data in his State of the Union speech. I mean, first off, let's remind ourselves that it was very early on after October 7th, as Israel was beginning this genocidal massacre of the people of Gaza, that Biden came out and openly doubted the numbers coming from the Gaza Ministry of Health. He was one of the first people to downplay the amount of civilians that have been killed. So, let's not portray him as some sort of like a big Israel critic here or something. But so what's actually going on here, right? What is the truth? Well, we have a great breakdown in this thread from Mark Owen Jones. And he starts off saying this: I'm somewhat dismayed, though sadly unsurprised, by this extremely disingenuous and callous reporting about Palestinian death figures. Claims that the United Nations have revised down its death toll are absolutely untrue, but have been repeated by right-wing outlets and also the CFR, and also liberal outlets as well. I mean, I just showed you guys, Morning Joe tweeting this out. So he says these media outlets are focusing on these two infographics that were dropped by the OCHA, and the one on the left that you can see here was published on the 6th of May, so a few days ago, about a week ago. And the one on the right was published 2 days later on the 8th of May. As you can see, total fatalities increase, not decrease, increase. What the propaganda is seeking to do is barely sophistry. So effectively what this comes down to is they clarified the difference between the total amount of people who have been reported to be killed versus the amount of people who can be completely identified, meaning you know their age, you know their gender, you know their identification number, you know all of the details about the person who has been killed. The remaining, which is not included in that figure that they updated the graphic with, the remaining are people who have been either, it's unable to be, fully clarified who the person is because they've been blown into a million pieces, or maybe there are people who are stuck under the rubble who they haven't been able to get to their bodies yet, or for whatever given reason, those people have not been fully identified. It doesn't mean that they aren't people. It doesn't mean that they haven't been killed. It just means they're in a different category as of right now, okay? So I just want to make this as clear as we can possibly get. Now, he goes on here to say that all that's happening is that the OCHA has added figures for the dead that have been identified. It quite clearly says that the breakdown does not include the estimated 10,000 that are missing or buried under the rubble. Even in the summary notes on this report that came out, on both days, it is quite clear that the total fatalities has increased. It's not revised the number downwards and has not stated that of the 10,000 missing or buried under the rubble, that they have somehow magically changed their sex or age, right? And one of the most perverse aspects of this is that if you go down here, he did this little, napkin calculation here, but the numbers are accurate based on the claims from the Gaza Ministry of Health. If you just assume that the ratio from this report of the amount of men, the percentage of men who have been killed, the percentage of women who have been killed, and the percentage of children who have been killed, and then you add on that number to each of these numbers that were recently reported, it comes out to basically the same exact percentage of women and children who have been killed that we've already been reporting on, right? What have I been saying over the last couple of months? That it's around 2/3 of the people who have been killed in Gaza have been women and children. So if you take a conservative estimate and you assume that these percentages released by the United Nations are accurate in these revised updates, then it would still be close to 60%. of the people who have been killed so far have been women and children. So the dishonesty in mainstream media figures and supposedly respected publications, right? That they are all getting this wrong. They are all trying to make this a claim that actually the Gaza Ministry of Health was just caught in a massive lie and they doubled the amount of women and children who have been killed. That is a complete lie. That is a complete fabrication. That is not what this updated UN report says at all. And I mean, some of the more glaring aspects, and you can, look at this down below if you guys want to, some of the more glaring aspects of this report are insane. I mean, they go on to detail some of the other destruction of civilian infrastructure, of the water systems, of agriculture inside of Gaza. And it's just unimaginable, the amount of destruction that has happened over the last 6 or 7 months. So to use this report to downplay what's happening right now is as disgusting as it gets. Now, to just, put a fine point on this, to make it explicitly clear for everybody, we actually had, an official representative here from the United Nations who clarified all of this. He says here, today, Farhan Haq, the deputy spokesperson for the Secretary General, was asked about this halving of the, women and children who have been killed number. He refutes the halving narrative, stating clearly that the Gaza Ministry of Health have fully identified 24,686 of the dead. Haq goes on to state that the 35,000 or larger number of fatalities remains unchanged. Remains unchanged. What's changed is the Ministry of Health in Gaza has updated the breakdowns of fatalities for whom full details have been documented. So in other words, what this report is actually saying is that the Gaza Ministry of Health is being even more precise. They're being even more specific with the categorizations of people who they have tallied to have been killed or injured. This should be the takeaway from this report should be a praise of the Gaza Ministry of Health. But somehow everybody is using this to attack their numbers, even though in previous conflicts, their numbers have been demonstrated when there are investigations after the fact to be incredibly reliable and accurate. But you have this massive sort of twisting and spinning of the narrative here that's been going on. So this was infuriating to me. This was absolutely enraging to me, but simultaneously not surprising at all. So, I mean, there you have it. Again, I'll link these sources down below if you want to go fact check anything here. But, I mean, again, just the dishonesty in this moment to try to justify the endless slaughter of innocent men, women, and children is mind-blowing to me. Now, we move on because there's some other things that I want to mention here. We have more videos that have been coming out. This one was posted here by Mustafa Barghouti. And what you guys are seeing here is, as he points out here, the Israeli army continuing its war of destruction and genocide, destroying an entire neighborhood in Rafah. So as they're escalating the offensive inside of Rafah, where more than 1 million people have been forced into a giant refugee camp with the entire rest of the Gaza Strip obliterated, this is the kind of shit they're doing. So, I mean, you can see, first off, notice something, guys. This doesn't look like an airstrike. What this looks like is a controlled demolition of an entire city block, essentially. It's a controlled demolition, meaning there was no Hamas hiding in these buildings. They weren't in an active firefight. They didn't get some intelligence that then led to an airstrike. They had time to go into these buildings, to rig explosives, and then to level it to the ground. We've seen this before, not just with residential buildings, but also with university buildings. We also just saw, I have another video here for you guys, of them doing this with a mosque that it looks like was already pretty much completely destroyed. So here we have an Israeli drone, going into this mosque. They're looking around. Clearly you can see there's nobody in it. It's already, again, largely destroyed. And then you back it up, and again, controlled demolition. Let's just level it to the ground for the sake of it, right? This is the kind of shit that's been going on. Gives you a little bit of an indication what the priorities in Gaza are. Now, we also have more and more threads like this that are coming out, and I've covered stuff like this before so many times on the channel that I'm not going to get into every single specific example here, but we have more IDF soldiers posting their own war crimes, human rights abuses on social media platforms. So here we have a bunch of, IDF soldiers who look like they're in, I don't know, some vehicle or some room, looking at a display here that has a home in Gaza on it, and they're blowing it up. And then they're turning around and pointing the camera at themselves and, just kind of laughing about the whole thing, right? I mean, enjoying themselves, having a grand old time during this genocide. I mean, we also have more stuff like this, right? I mean, just a couple other examples. Israeli soldier Noah Moore from Gaza. He said, "And so, the era of Gaza has come to an end. It was an insane experience in which we inflicted a psychotic amount of destruction. A psychotic amount of destruction. Demolishing, shooting, bombing, and bursting through endless corridors. Hashtag Thailand Gaza." I don't know, is this like a dual citizen Thailand, Israel guy? I don't know. I mean, we also have videos like this and images like this. I mean, this is just a guy who looks to be shooting a grenade launcher at a bombed out house for fun, I guess. This is another one here that was captioned, "Nova City, we building you," in reference to build an Israeli settlement on the ruins of Gaza, which is something that has been floated by members of Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition, like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. And again, I mean, this looks like it was posted on Instagram. I mean, a guy holding a sledgehammer destroying some civilian building with a giant smile on his face, right? And contrast that with just the relentless, endless suffering of average Palestinian civilians right now. Another one here, he posted the caption, "Gaza is dead," while sitting on a looted couch that previously belonged to some Gazan family who may have been killed or displaced or who knows what. We have another one here, another soldier saying, "In Gaza, or what's left of it," flipping off the camera here, posting that on social media. I mean, just so many examples, guys. It's countless. It's countless. I mean, I'll link the thread down below if you want to go look at more of them. I don't know if I could possibly take much more, but posting their own war crimes on social media for the entire world to see because they're proud of it. They're proud of it. Now, moving on, we also have additional reporting backing up the previous reporting that we've been getting for months now. Here from Human Rights Watch, Gaza, Israelis attacking known aid worker locations. So in this report, they mentioned the WCK strike, which is what's pictured right here, where there was a triple tap drone strike of this aid convoy that was in communication with the IDF and then was struck multiple different times in what was supposed to be a deconflicted zone, meaning this was not supposed to be an area where armed conflict was even taking place. And they detail in this specific report 8 different instances of situations exactly like that one, where you have aid workers who are in active communication with the IDF about their plans, about their whereabouts, about where they're going, right? And they're in communication with the IDF, they're acting in deconflicted zones, and they are still struck and killed. 8 different examples just in this one report here. Now, we've also had some more of these State Department press briefings. In this one, we have Ryan Grimm, okay, shout out to Ryan, who was questioning, I think it was Patel in this one, yeah. And he's questioning Patel about some American doctors who are trapped inside of Gaza right now, and what exactly the U.S. government position is on that, and what it says about the broader context of what's going on in Gaza, given that some of these American doctors have only recently, gotten to Gaza and have been there for a limited period of time and are already suffering in incalculable ways. So let's go ahead and watch this quick back and forth here.
Citizens, doctors who are at the European hospital in Khan Yunis facing dehydration. At least one of them is on an IV drip now. Our understanding is that relatives have been in touch with the State Department, U.S. administration. Is there anything you can say about efforts to get them out? And was the UN vehicle that was on the way to the European hospital part of those efforts?
So let me start with the second part. I'm not sure of the operational and logistical specifics of what was involved in those specific efforts or not, but I can say is that we're aware of these reports of U.S. citizens, doctors, and medical professionals currently unable to leave Gaza. As I said before, we don't control this border crossing, and this is a incredibly complex situation that has very serious implications for the safety and security of U.S. citizens, but we're continuing to work around the clock with the government of Israel, with the government of Egypt, to work on this issue, not just to address the very serious humanitarian assistance concerns that I just talked about, but as you so pointed out, and Matt have addressed before, Rafah is a conduit for the safe departure of foreign nationals, which is why we continue to want to see it get opened as swiftly as possible.
And what does it say about conditions more generally in Rafah and in Khan Yunis if American doctors who only arrived there recently are already suffering from dehydration and malnutrition?
So look, we have not been unambiguous about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. It is a crisis. No amount of humanitarian aid at this moment is enough. We need to be doing everything we can to get more humanitarian aid, food, medicine, water, other appropriate supplies.
I mean, I can't take any more of this motherfucker. I mean, listen, guys, when he says we don't control this border, when he says we want to see more aid getting into Gaza, or we want to see less civilian suffering happening in Gaza, he's just bullshitting you. I mean, how stupid do these people think we are? I don't think I've ever seen human beings who say so much while saying nothing at all at the same time than these State Department ghouls. Because there's no country, there is no single individual that has more power over what is happening in Gaza right now than the United States of America and Joe Biden. The idea that, like, well, we don't control the border crossing with Rafah, so what are we going to do about these American doctors who went to Gaza and pretty much immediately, became severely malnourished and dehydrated because there isn't enough fucking supplies for them inside of Gaza because Israel is blocking the aid from getting in. And they just turn around, they act as if we are powerless in this situation. Israel just took control of the Rafah, the border crossing to Egypt. They just took control of that. They have control over the entry and exit of people and goods and aid into Gaza. They have full control over that. The idea that, like, well, I guess Israel's going to do what they're going to do. I guess maybe they're going to kill these doctors and we couldn't have done anything about it. It's absurd and it's disgusting. I mean, do you guys remember a while back when Joe Biden had that quote that's been floating around? If you harm an American, we will come after you, right? What about these Americans? What about these Americans who are putting everything on the line, going into probably the most perilous situation you could possibly imagine, putting their own lives in danger, to go and help people on the opposite end of the earth, who are being subjected to a genocide that is being armed by our country, and you just have nothing really to say about it, other than like, well, we're powerless. What are we going to do in this situation? I mean, it's just fucking pathetic. Now, we also have more clips from this guy, Patel. Here we have, a question from a reporter. We have Israeli politicians saying that they want to see Gaza erased and want to recolonize it. And his response is, rhetoric is just rhetoric. It's just a distraction. Rhetoric is just rhetoric. What about when their rhetoric is fully and completely backed by their actions? What about that? Then what? I mean, it's pointed out here by Crystal, when it's an Israeli official who has actual power over what's happening in Gaza, it's just, it's rhetoric is just rhetoric, and it's a distraction. But when it's powerless college students with provocative rally chants, it's cause for a total complete crackdown, official presidential condemnations, and actual laws banning dissent. And she's completely correct here, right? Now, we also have other statements like this. I mean, this was Jake Sullivan here at the White House podium, who just straight up said, we do not believe what's happening in Gaza is a genocide. Okay, surprise, surprise, we know that's been the U.S. position for a long time now. Israel could literally drop 20 nukes on the Gaza Strip, and the U.S. would still not say that it's a genocide. But I mean, this even goes in contrast to what basically every single major human rights organization and historian and expert that I've seen talk about this, what their position is. I mean, just a couple examples here from Newsweek. Israel committing a textbook case of genocide. Holocaust historian says. We got Holocaust historians saying this is a textbook case of genocide. Another one, UN expert says Israel has committed acts of genocide in Gaza. Another one, Israel not complying with World Court order in genocide case from Human Rights Watch. Another one, textbook case of genocide. Top UN official Craig Mokhiber resigns and denounces Israeli assault on Gaza. This was back in November. We had UN officials who were saying it's a textbook case of genocide and resigning their positions in protest of inaction against Israel to stop them. That was like a month and a half into this. We had people saying this. But we're now 6-7 months into it, and the U.S. government can't seem to make up their mind, right? Now, one last one here. We've been talking about the investigations that Israel supposedly is doing into themselves. I'm sure they're going to hold themselves accountable, right? Going to put out honest reports and all of that, right? And so we had another reporter here who asked, on reports of human rights violations at detention centers, right? Remember those torture camps, the concentration camps that I showed you guys a couple of days ago, that are inside of Israeli, detention centers where they're just mass rounding up civilians from Gaza and then subjecting them to torture. So the question is, on that story, you asked Israel to investigate itself, but would you support an independent investigation? And the State Department spokesperson essentially said no. I mean, he used a bunch of words to say it, but effectively he said no. We've seen this in previous examples as well. Every single time that there is some allegation of a egregious war crime or a massive, human rights abuse that takes place, they just turn around and they say, well, we're going to have Israel investigate themselves, right? It reminds me of that meme that floats around all the time in these kinds of situations where it's like, that old New York Times article about the CIA saying, CIA, we investigated ourselves and found that we had no link to the crack trade, for example, right? I mean, it's exactly like that. Israel is not a credible source of information, let alone a credible source to investigate themselves, to hold themselves accountable. I mean, what a fucking slap in the face. On top of the egregious war crimes that you are fully complicit in, you're going to turn around and say, oh, but we're going to investigate those war crimes. We're just going to have the people who did the war crimes, the war criminals themselves, are going to investigate their own war crimes. Tell me how that makes any sense. Now, as all of this is happening, and as we got those previous reports that I told you guys were mostly bullshit, of Joe Biden deciding, okay, well, I said that Rafah was a red line. It's still not really a red line, and they haven't really gone into the densely populated portions of Rafah, so I'm not going to completely cut off weapons, but I'm going to maybe stop sending so many 2,000-pound bombs. Just a couple days after we got that reporting. Now we have this. Biden moves forward on $1 billion in new arms for Israel. This is literally a couple days after he did this whole posturing, virtue signaling of, oh, well, this is my real red line. They can't go into Rafah. I'm going to cut off some of the weapons. Here's another $1 billion for you. After you've already violated my previously stated red line, I'm going to give you another $1 billion in weapons to use against this civilian population that even I, Joe Biden, admit that you are indiscriminately bombing. What the fuck are we doing? What are we doing? They're contradicting themselves, even in the extreme right-wing, hawkish support that Joe Biden has shown for Israel over the last 6 or 7 months. Even with that characterization of Joe Biden, he's still contradicting himself, right? You can't come out and say, we don't want them to go into Rafah. You can't come out and say, we're concerned about the amount of civilians that will be massacred if they go into Rafah, and then turn around and give them another $1 billion in weapons. What are you doing? Now, I'll finish off with this, because this is almost just as important as anything else. In terms of defining and coming to a realization of something that we have been saying since the beginning of this, which is the basic conclusion that Israel cannot militarily defeat Hamas. It is not possible. We've seen this in other circumstances where you have a domestic group that is fighting against a foreign invader or a foreign occupier, and they are using guerrilla tactics as a part of their strategy, and they're embedded deeply within the civilian population. You are never going to be able to use standard military tactics to avoid or to destroy that guerrilla army. It's never going to work. It's never going to work. We saw this in Vietnam. We saw this in Afghanistan. We've seen this over and over and over again, but somehow nobody can learn the lessons of history. You are never going to be able to militarily defeat Hamas. They say here, Dennis Ross, one thing is clear. The fact that the IDF has had to go back into Jabalia, as well as Zitoun, and soon also Khan Yunis, is a reminder that no plan existed for what would replace Hamas. Yes, Hamas is weakened, but without an alternative to it, it will fill the vacuum. And this is what we have been seeing over the last couple of months, is that in places that Israel has already gone into, they've already, cleared Hamas out of there, right? And destroyed Hamas in these locations, whether it's the northern portions of Gaza or Khan Yunis or wherever else, and flattened these areas into oblivion. After the IDF starts removing their troops from that location, what happens? Hamas comes back. And then now suddenly, you're having to turn around to go back to those places, right? This is going to continue happening. Regardless of what happens in Rafah, regardless of what happens, you are not going to defeat them through military means. And that's not just my opinion. That's the opinion of basically every single U.S. military official as well. They've been saying this for months. You need, if you want to get rid of Hamas as the leadership structure of Gaza, it has to be a political solution. Hamas would not exist as it does today if it were not for Israel. Okay? Let's make that explicitly clear. You don't have random armed resistance groups that pop up when everything is going fine. You have armed resistance groups that pop up and engage in violence when you, as a state, as the occupying power, are occupying them. If you are subjecting a population for decades and decades and decades to occupation and apartheid and ethnic cleansing, guess what's going to happen? There's going to be blowback. So you can tamp down Hamas, you can weaken some of their military capabilities, but you are not going to be able to defeat them. Even if you killed every single current member of Hamas, something else would crop up in its place that is still going to represent violent resistance to occupation. That's not going anywhere, right? And so this is something that at some point you would assume Israel has to admit. that they've been defeated. They've been defeated. If the goal is to completely eliminate Hamas, you've lost. You've lost, and there is no pathway forward to victory, aside from ending this current genocide and then actually moving forward with a long-term peace plan to give Palestinians full human rights and dignity and sovereignty. That's the only way out of this. It's that, or it's a complete genocide and the obliteration of Palestinians altogether, which is the direction that the government of Israel wants to go. So, I mean, there you have it, guys. Again, typical, standard IDF posting their war crimes on social media platforms, U.S. media and politicians continuing to spread lies on behalf of trying to justify this ongoing genocide, continued reports about the attacks on aid shipments, along with previous reports I've mentioned about how the aid getting into this starving population has essentially come to a full halt since Israel took over the crossing at the Rafah border with Egypt. I mean, just nightmare after nightmare after nightmare. And in the meantime, what is our government doing? We're sending them billions of dollars in additional weapons on top of the billions we've been giving them for decades.
Politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying